Okay, so I'm finally ready for part 3 of the ultimate miter saw station build. And this part is going to be all about drawers. I'm going to put drawers on this side and on this side. But I don't want to fill up this whole place with drawers. So I'm going to have one here, and I will have space for my shop stool. So I'll have space for my shop stool here, and then on this side I'm gonna have 3 drawers, so about halfway down, and then I'll have space for storing some bigger things underneath. So let's get started. I've been in this shop for over 6 years now. I have made lots of projects, lots of videos, and I've really enjoyed my time here. But now it's time to say goodbye. That's right guys, everything is going down. These shelves, the benches, the miter saw station, even some of the walls. This shop is history. Now that makes me a bit sad, but the good news is we are rebuilding everything and will make it a lot better. This space will be optimized for YouTube videos. We'll paint the walls, we'll cover up some windows, have new lights, lots of new shop furniture, and we're taking down this wall. Oh, heck. Because behind this wall is more than 30 square meters of space that will now be a part of the shop, making the woodshop area more than twice as big. So in total, with all of the parts of the shop, we will have almost 80 square meters.
Here's a little recap of what we've done so far. This space was originally used for storage and for animals. So the first step was to get rid of all the stuff that was in here, clean up a bit, and then take down the old fences. Now the next step was to dig some poop. There was a lot of poop. We've had both goats, sheep and chickens here, so there was a lot of poop to get rid of. It did take me a couple of hours, but once it was done, we could start to see glimpses of what this place would look like. Once I had done some digging, my dad came over to help me, and I want to give a huge shout out to my dad here. Not only is he helping me with the rebuild, but he is also the owner of this barn, and he basically lets me do whatever I want here. So huge thanks to my dad.
Okay, so now we're back here, and the next step is to cover up some of the old door openings and some of the holes. There has been chickens here, as I said, so there are some holes in the wall that I'll need to fix. And once that is done, we can get ready to knock down this wall, which will be very exciting. So we might have an issue already, because why is there no vapor barrier on this wall? There is clearly on this wall, there is on this wall as well. So why is there nothing on this wall? I have no idea, but I might have to take down everything from this wall, all of the boards, put on vapor barrier, then put the boards back on again, because I'm using these boards in the shop. I'm just going to paint them. Now that would be okay, but what I'm a lot more worried about is if there's vapor barrier on the walls in the shop. I might have to take down all of the plywood from the walls, like all of the walls and the ceiling as well, put on vapor barrier, and then put the plywood back on again. That would be one heck of a job. And a lot more job than I expected. Okay, moment of truth. Fingers crossed. Please. There's no vapor barrier. Jeez. I mean, it's pretty obvious what the smart thing would be to do here. That would be, of course, to take down all of the plywood, put on vapor barrier, put the plywood back up again. That means this is going to be a much bigger job than I expected, for sure. So let's get started.
So I started taking down all the boards from the wall and getting out all of the mouse infested insulation and getting the walls ready for vapor barrier. Once that was done, I could start tackling the holes in the wall. So I put these 1.5 by 3s between the studs to create a support that I could screw the Hunton boards in from the outside. Then I caulked the seams and put on Halotex and tape. And when putting the cladding back on again, I made sure to have a 15-degree cut on both ends so that the water would flow down. I did this on all of the holes, then moved on to the old door and windows, where I basically did the same thing. Now, by the way guys, if you go to aribaloney.com, you can find a list of all the tools I'm using on a regular basis. You'll also find some woodworking plans there that you can check out if you're interested in that. The tool list is also in the description. And if you want exclusive content, early access to videos and discounts on my website, and also help support the channel, you can do so by becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/aribaloney.
Okay, so the reason why I am covering up this window is because I want to have the dust collector in a separate room in the corner over here, and this window is exactly where I want to have this wall. So I'll need to cover it up, then I move the window over here because it's nice to have at least one window in this end of the shop.
While I worked on the new part of the shop, my dad started cleaning the old part and making it ready to take down the plywood and put on the vapor barrier. Once again, huge thanks to my dad. Make sure you give him a shout out in the comments.
Okay, so now I've come to a very exciting moment because this room is like pretty much ready. We will have an electrician come over and do all of the electrical stuff because here in Norway the rules are very strict when it comes to what you're allowed to do of electrical work. So I'm just going to leave that for the pros. But now we can take down this wall and open up everything. So we're going to start by just removing the boards on the back here because we can reuse them when fixing this wall over here. So let's start removing the boards.
Getting down this wall was amazing. This space felt so open and big, and now we could move on to the next step of the rebuild.
Okay, so now the plywood is down, the insulation has been fixed, and now we're ready to put on the vapor barrier, put the plywood back on again, and then we're going to paint it before we put back all of the furniture.
I wanted the walls to have a mid-tone grey, so not too dark and not too light. I also wanted it to be a little bit brownish and not feel too cold. I basically wanted a warm grey. After looking a bit, I found a color called warm grey, and it was perfect. I don't have a spray gun, so I used a paint roller, but I wasn't too happy with the finish, so I tried to use a brush on the second coat, and it turned out better. Once the walls had dried, I could start working on the ceiling. I took down all the pipes for the dust collection and could start taking down the plywood. I had some questions in the previous video on whether or not it is necessary to have a vapor barrier, and that really depends. If you know there's going to be a large difference in the temperature inside versus outside of the building, then as a general rule you should have vapor barrier. Now, I live in Norway, it can get really cold in the winter and I plan on having my shop heated, so it would be a mistake not to have a vapor barrier here.
Good morning guys, the lights are back on. I installed some LED panels and we'll take a look at those later, but now we're moving on to section number 2 of the shop. So I'm going to get rid of everything on the walls and we can get started getting the plywood down. Also this means the lights will be out for these clips, so I'm not going to have a whole lot of footage. I'm going to skip ahead pretty quickly to when the ceiling is done and the lights are back on. Now, I'm really lucky that I get to borrow this elevator thing from work, but if you're doing something similar and you don't have access to something like this, what you could do instead is to make a T out of some 2x4. So you have a long piece, then you have a shorter piece that goes across. Maybe you make 2 of those, and you want to make them like in total maybe 2 centimeters longer than the distance from the floor to the ceiling. Then you can sort of jam those in, and that will make sure that the plywood stays in place until you have all the screws out or all the screws in. Okay, so we are ready to install some more lights in this part of the shop. I've already installed a couple here. So what I went with is some LED panels. So I bought these. This is what they look like, and the main reason why I bought them was that they were on a discount, but they also had the right Kelvin that I was looking for. These are 4000 kelvins, and Kelvin is basically the color of the light. So the lower the Kelvin is, the more yellow or orange it will appear. The higher it is, the more white it will be. I went with 4000, which apparently is a pretty natural color. I've seen some YouTubers who are using 5000 or 5600 kelvins, which probably works great for me. That feels kind of like a hospital light. It feels a bit too white, so I went with 4000, and let's get these installed and see what they look like.
So if you're new to this channel and you enjoy this content, please consider subscribing. And if you want to buy some woodworking plans or see a list of my recommended tools, you can go to rabaloney.com.
So the ceiling is done, the lights are up. I'm feeling great right now. I love the lights, I love the color. Everything just looks a whole lot better in the shop right now. The plywood looks better, the color looks even better. So I'm really happy. And you can see already that it's going to be a lot easier to make videos and have consistent light in the videos now. So that's great, and I can't wait to get the lights up in the end of the shop. So the next step now is to do the walls here. So we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to take down the plywood, put on vapor barrier, put the plywood back up again, and then we're going to paint. So the worst part is done, the ceiling. That was the part that I sort of dreaded the most, but that is done, so that feels really, really good. So let's get started with walls.
These boards were laying outside for a few days and unfortunately they got a bit wet. They had been drying indoors for some days, but before painting them I wanted to check the moisture level. So I used my Eric Hill EWM02, and this is a very handy tool to have in your shop. So if you want to check this out, there's a link in the description.
Now for the final wall I decided to do something a little bit controversial, and that is to cover up the window completely. There are a few reasons why I did this. Number one was because of the light. When you have a big window like this, it is really hard to get consistent light in the videos. Also, this was just a homemade window made of plexiglass, so there was basically no insulation, and also it was leaking water, so there was water inside of the shop and also water inside of the wall. Finally, I plan on moving the miter saw station over and having some cabinets right where the window is, so even though I'm going to miss the view, it was the right decision to cover it up. Okay, so now all of the walls are done and we're ready to get some paint on them. I'm gonna have a section behind me here that is going to be black. That's going to be like a background for a tool wall that I'm building, and also for the miter saw station and some cabinets. And then the rest of the walls are going to be gray. Okay, so the paint is dried and I'm really happy with the color. I think it turned out great. Now, by the way, these outlets will be black. Okay, don't worry about it. It will not look like this. But now we can start to put everything back into place. The miter saw stations, the miter saw station, the benches, the tools, machines, everything will get back into place. For now, I'm not sure entirely about the layout of the shop, so I'm just gonna have to start to put things in place, and we'll sort of nail down the layout later. But now it's going to be real nice to have some order in the shop again. So I cannot tell you guys how happy I am with the way that this looks so far. It really is turning out exactly how I wanted it. And this truly is what an ecstatic Norwegian guy looks like.
I'm sorry if I disappointed some of you. I realize there's a reason why so many woodworkers are using the French cleat system. So even though I came up with some ideas, they just weren't as good as the French cleat system. So I tried to reinvent the wheel, right? I started by cutting some strips at around 80mm with a 45-degree cut on one of the edges. I fastened them to the wall first by using some brad nails. I made sure that the bottom strip was level and then used some distance blocks for the rest. Then I put a bunch of screws in where the studs are before painting the cleats black. Once the cleats were up, I could start building the tool holders, and I started with some clamp racks. I've started buying some Bessie clamps and I'm going to buy more of them in the future. So these clamp racks are made to fit Bessie clamps, but as you'll see, you can fit other brands in them as well. I've made some woodworking plans for some of these tool holders, including the clamp racks. You can find these on my website araboloni.com. You'll also find other woodworking plans there, as well as recommended tools and some merchandise. I'll put a link for this in the description below. Next up, I started building a drill charging station for my drills, chargers and batteries. And one of the great things about building a tool wall like this is that you get to use up some scrap plywood. I did not buy any plywood for this project specifically, I just used leftovers from other projects. So one of the things that I wanted to do with this tool wall was to not just build storage for the tools that I have, but also for the tools that I think I'm going to get. So for this drill charging station, there's still room for more drills and batteries, because I guess you can never have too many of those. Here I'm cutting out a hole for the outlet, because I planned on having the charging station directly on top of the outlet. Now I ended up moving the station down a bit later, so I don't use the hole now, but if I decide to move it again later, there's at least room for the outlet.
So just a reminder that I do have some woodworking plans available for most of the tool holders that I'll build. You can find those on my website ariboloni.com or see the link in the description. Now let us build something for the router.
So I made this router shelf that could fit my router, some bits and tools, again made from leftover plywood.
Then I just added a bunch of holders for different types of tools, like the circular saw, some hand tools, screwdrivers, chisels, my sander, and last but not least, a plant. And this is why the French cleat system is so genius. You can make tool holders for pretty much anything you want. You can just add it on the wall. So the tool wall is looking really good, but there are two more things I'd like to add. And first off is some downlights. So I'm going to use some of these lights. They are super easy to install. It's just one screw and you can adjust them, adjust the angle however you like, and then you just plug them in. So I'm going to have 3 of these, and that should give a pretty good light down on the tool wall. And the final thing that I added was the no smoking areas sign, and this has been in the shop for years now, but finally it's going to get a properly lit up place. I don't know why, I just really like that sign. Of course, the possibilities are endless with a French cleat tool wall, and I'm probably going to add some more stuff on the bottom, maybe some more storage on the top, but this will work for now. 6 years ago I built this, the ultimate miter saw station. But as it turns out, it wasn't really the ultimate one. So now I want to build a new and better one, but the problem is I don't want to spend a whole lot of money on it. So in this video I'm going to try to build a highly functional, good looking, modular miter saw station, and according to my calculations, I'm going to be able to do it for under $500.
The biggest expense of this build is definitely the plywood. Regular plywood here in Norway will cost around $70 to $80 per sheet, which I know is already cheaper than most places in the US. So the plywood I'm using is called like package boards or shipping boards here in Norway. I think they're normally used for making shipping boxes. They cost around $15 to $20 and they are sold as defective products. They have a few marks and stains, but I know from experience that if you give them some sanding, they can look really, really good. I needed a total of 18 sheets, which brought the expenses so far up to $378. I started by cutting all the parts that I needed for the cabinets, and I did this mostly using my track saw, but also the table saw. Sorting out which parts need to be cut where in order to get the most out of the plywood can be a pain in the butt, but I had made some cut charts beforehand, which made all of this a lot easier. Next day, I woke up. It was a beautiful snowy morning here in Norway, and I sat there drinking coffee in silence, looking out the window, when I thought to myself, you know what, Mr. Baloney? This is a perfect day to screw up this project. But before I did that, I cut some strips that the drawers could slide on inside of the cabinets. These would be the drawer slides. I needed 10 on each side in all of the 5 big cabinets that I was building. So in total, I had to cut 100 strips, and I used 9mm plywood for this. Or so I thought, at least. Now, this miter saw station is heavily inspired by Dennis from Hooked on Wood and Drew from Woodworks. The drawer system I'm gonna use is the exact same as both of them have used for their shop cabinets, and I highly recommend checking out both of their channels. I'm sure there are a lot more people who have used the same system. It's a modular system and it's pretty genius, and it's very cheap since I'm not gonna buy any drawer slides for this miter saw station. The part of the drawer that will slide on these strips is the drawer bottom. These are 9mm thick, and so I needed to have a 10mm space between the strips. In order to make this repeatable, I made a pretty simple jig with some distance blocks that set the space between each strip, but also the distance from the strip to the front edge of the cabinet. I fastened these using some brad nails, and I made sure to use plenty of them. For cabinets, I don't really think it's necessary to have full sheets of plywood on all the sides, the back and the top and the bottom. So instead, I just used 5 15cm boards for stretchers, and this will be more than strong enough. Here I am just routing some grooves for shelves in this small cabinet. Now at this point I had already made the mistake. Unfortunately though, I didn't notice this until the next day after I had made all of the 28 drawers. So the next day I started cutting all of the parts for the drawers, and now I'll explain why I think this system is so genius. So the strips in the cabinets, aka the homemade drawer slides, are all starting at every 80mm. The drawers are in 3 sizes: 80mm, 160mm and 240mm. This means that the drawers can be switched around however you like. So if you have 3 slots, you could have one big drawer there, or you could have one medium and one small, or 3 small ones. And if you use the same system on all drawers and cabinets in the shop, which is what I plan on doing, you can easily switch them around. Now, I decided to make 28 drawers, so I needed a total of 112 drawer sides and fronts and backs. Once again, I used the cut chart, and by the way, if you want to build this miter saw station yourself, I have made some woodworking plans for it. This is a 70-page PDF with all the cut charts, material list, and detailed step-by-step instructions for building this miter saw station. So these and many other plans are available on ariboloni.com. Now, to make things easier for me when assembling the drawer, I made 2 simple fences that made up a 90-degree corner. Once again, I just used some brad nails as there won't really be a lot of weight on the drawer sides. The weight will be directed to the drawer bottom. The drawer bottoms are made from 9mm plywood. MDF might slide a little bit better, but the plywood works great as well. I love using the track saw for these cuts, as my DeWalt table saw can't really cut that wide. Also, a lot of these cuts are exactly the same, so you can just stack several sheets of plywood on top of each other, and it makes the cutting a whole lot faster. These drawer bottoms are super simple to assemble. I used a piece of 9mm plywood to get the right overhang and fastened using some brad nails. And of course, the drawer frames are a little bit lower than the drawer fronts. And this is where I discovered the mistake I had made. Some of the drawers wouldn't fit. This stressed me out a bit, and it took me some time to figure out why. I thought maybe the drawers were too big or that the stretchers of the cabinets were too short, but that wasn't it. The problem was the plywood. I just assumed that they were 9mm when actually some of them were 9.5. That doesn't sound like much, but it was enough that some of the drawers wouldn't slide smoothly at all. Luckily, this was a pretty simple fix because I just added some small wooden shims that made the cabinets a little bit wider, and you can't really see the shims. The next step now was to remove the old miter saw station, and to be perfectly honest, even though I've had this for a few years, this wasn't very sad. I was just excited to get the new one up and running. And by the way, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button and put on the bell notifications so that you don't miss out on the next one. Next up, I installed the toe kick, and I made this pretty simple. I just leveled it up using some wooden shims and wedges, and I started installing the cabinet, and then I put in the drawers. Now again, the goal here is to make this as cheap as possible. So for the bench tops, I'm doing it simple. No fancy material, no expensive formica, just a double layer of good old defected plywood that I'll finish with Osmo top oil. And since I'm a freak in the sheets of plywood, I used 2 halves on the first layer, and this saved me 1 sheet of plywood. Now for the shelf for the miter saw, I built a simple frame of plywood and used plywood as the top.
What a shocker.
To set the height of the shelf, I just measured the miter saw table, subtracted 12mm for the plywood top, and I added 1mm. I added 1 because it's easier to add a small shim or washer under the saw if the shelf is too low than to lower the saw afterwards. Under the miter saw shelf, I wanted to have some cabinet doors to cover the dust extractor and other things. And of course, I didn't spend any money on handles. I just drilled a simple hole, which I think looks pretty good, to be honest. The cabinet door hinges are the only hardware on this entire miter station, and since I'm using only 12mm plywood, I had to be careful not to protrude the front. So I used a chisel until the holes were deep enough for the hinges. The hinges cost $8 for a pack of 2, so let's add $16 to the total cost. There are a few ways to install these doors. I just put some blocks of wood on the floor until I had the right height and screw the hinges in place where they were. This was pretty simple, and you also have some room for adjustment in the hinges to get the height and the gaps perfect. I had one of these magnet locks laying around, and I added it on the bottom of the left cabinet door since this was the only corner that didn't close properly. Before making the drawer fronts, I made this pretty simple miter saw hood. Unlike the old hood, this one has no nooks and crannies where the dust will get stuck, and it's super easy to clean. I might put some more in the front to collect more of the dust, but I'm not sure what that would be yet, so for now I'm just gonna leave it like this and see how it works. So drawer fronts. I went for a cut out drawer handle, mostly to save money, but I also think it looks really good. There are, however, a few downsides to this type of handle. First off, there will be more dust in the drawers. Now that's not something that I worry about too much, because in my experience you will get dust in the drawers anyways, and I don't think it will make a huge difference, but we will see. Also, you open the drawers with the palms down, which is not the most comfortable, but again, this is just a free option. If you want to get proper drawer handles on your drawers, it doesn't have to be extremely expensive. When installing the fronts, I like to use some playing cards to get an even gap. Then I just use some brad nails to secure the fronts before adding some screws. I honestly can't believe that this plywood is only $15 to $20 per sheet. I think it looks really, really good. For the small drawers, I had to cut the handle through the drawer front, but also through the drawer frame. So instead of making every cut twice, I cut out these handles after installing the fronts. So some of them required some chisel work and quite a bit of sanding, but they turned out pretty good. I also added this edge banding around the benchtop. This is a nice touch that makes the miter station look a whole lot better in my opinion. Of course you could use some hardware here, but I just went with plywood. Finally, I made some holes for the dust extractor hose and the power cord. Then I finished off with some Osmo top oil, and the miter station is done.
If you add up all of the expenses with the plywood, the hinges, screws, nails and the finish, it ended up at a total of $484. That is for the entire miter station and a full can of the Osmo top oil. So please let me know what you think of this build in the comments, and remember, if you want to build this yourself, you can get the detailed woodworking plans for this build on my website ariboloni.com. In this video, I'm going to show you how I built this assembly table that you can fold up and put it up against the wall and use it as a normal workbench. It has a built-in router lift, it has plenty of storage, and I'm going to show you how I built these drawers without using any drawer slides. As always, I'm going to show you everything you need to know to build this in this video. But if you want to make the build a little bit quicker, you can get woodworking plans, both in metric and imperial, on my Etsy store.
So I started by cutting the legs out of some 2x4. I cut 8 legs at 59 centimeters and then 8 at 60.2. And I set up a stop block to make the cuts easy to repeat.
So I got 8 2x4s at 59 centimeters and then 8 at 60.2. And now I'm going to take one of each and I'm just going to put them on top of each other. And then I've got this scrap 2x4 that I'm going to put underneath on one end and slide this up until it is flush with the 2x4, like that. And then on the other side, it should be like around 11.2 centimeters. So now I'm just going to put some glue on here, not on the scrap 2x4, but on the two longer ones.
putting this on top. Getting it flush at the top here, and also just going to make sure that it is nice and flush on the edges as well, like that. Then I'm going to put a couple of screws in here. So now I'm going to do that for all of the legs, 8 legs in total, and then I'm just going to let them dry for a little bit.
Then I started to build the bottom shelf, and I cut 4 2x4s at 105 centimeters and then 4 at 47 centimeters. I attached these by just pre-drilling some holes and using some screws. I then cut a couple of pieces of this very cheap 12mm plywood at roughly 115 by 47 centimeters that I fastened on top of the frame, again just using some screws. For the top frame I had 45-degree miter on the ends. These are 115 centimeters and 57 centimeters. Now at this point the legs had dried, so I gave them a quick round through the thickness planer before sanding them. The legs will need to have a tenon at the top, and I decided to do this on the bandsaw. I just made a cut down the middle of the end that sticks out 10 centimeters, and on 4 of them you want to cut the shoulder on the right side, and then on the other 4 legs you want to cut the shoulder on the left side. This is because all of the tenons need to face in towards the center of the workbench. So 4 of each of these ones. Again, I'm installing them with the tenon always in towards the center and attaching them using some screws on the underside of the shelf frame. I screwed 1 screw first, then made sure the leg was square before screwing the second screw. I could then install the top frame using the mitered pieces that I cut earlier. Once I had 2 of these, I could install the casters. These are some lockable casters that I got from Amazon, and I really like the color of these. I'll make sure to put a link for these as well as the other hardware and tools I used for this build in the description. Everything is also linked in the woodworking plans as well. Of course, you could just leave the benches like this without finishing, or you could finish with pretty much any type of finish that you like. I went for the Rubio Monocoat hybrid wood protector on the legs and frames. It gives a great layer of protection, and more importantly, it looks really cool. So this is pretty easy to apply. Just put on a decent layer using either a brush or a cloth, and after a few minutes wipe off the excess finish using a clean cotton cloth. I then added a double layer of 12mm plywood as the benchtop, and I cut it flush using the track saw. I gave the benchtop a quick sanding with 120 grit sandpaper before applying some Osmo top oil. So I installed these hinges at the back, and then at the front I needed something that could lock the benches in place. I figured that these toggle clamp latches would be the best option, as these will also pull the benches together. So I added one latch that would lock them in place in the long position, and then one that would lock them in place in the folded position. Now I could do the first proper test of the transforming workbench.
Okay, so I also want to add this router lift to this workbench or assembly table, and I thought about maybe adding like a table at the end here that you can flip up, flip down again. But I'm thinking, first of all, it's going to be a bit difficult to make it really solid and sturdy. And second, it's just not necessary. So what I'm going to do instead is to have the router lift here on the table. Of course, it's going to sit flush with the tabletop, so it's not going to be in the way whenever I'm doing some assembling or glue ups or something like that. So I'm going to have it here, and we got this Enjoy router lift for handheld routers for the DeWalt and Makita. They fit the DeWalt and Makita routers, and probably some more as well. I got this from Banggood, and I'll put a link for this down in the description. For the fence, of course, you can make it as fancy as you want to. You can have T-tracks and buy fences, and that's great, but for me, I like to just keep it simple and keep it cheap. So I'm just going to use this fence that I made out of plywood earlier, and you can just clamp it down on the tabletop. You don't really need anything more than that, or I don't at least. Now the router lift comes with a flush trim bit that you can use along with this template to get the right size and shape of the router lift. Unfortunately, the flush trim bit does not fit my router, and I don't have a similar one with a wheel on the top. But I think I'm going to be good just using a drill bit and jigsaw and fence.
I tried to cut using a fence and the jigsaw, but this did not go well. Once the blade went off the line a little bit, I didn't have the room to tilt the saw back at the line, so it was actually a lot better to just use the jigsaw without the fence. I then installed these corner brackets that come along with the router lift, they have these screws so that you can adjust the height of the router lift. This means you don't have to worry that much about the thickness of your workbench, because you do have some leeway. And once the router has been installed, you can use this tool to adjust the height of the router bit. And you also have this micro adjustment knob. So each turn with this red dial represents 1.5 millimeter. So you can get really accurate with the height adjustment. And now we're moving on to the drawers. So I started by making two small cabinets with 12mm plywood. I'm going to use a drawer system that I've used before on my miter station. I've also seen Drew from Whitworks and Dennis from Hooked and Wood use something similar. It uses some plywood or MDF strips as drawer slides, so it's really cheap as well. The cabinets are pretty simple. Make sure you measure the distance between the top and bottom frame to get the right height of the cabinet. If you're using some thicker plywood for the bottom shelf, you might have to make some adjustments here. These strips, aka drawer slides, are cut from 9mm plywood. They are 7 cm wide and 51 cm long. But first we'll need a thin strip at 2 cm wide that we install at the bottom. After that, I use a piece of 12mm plywood as a spacer and install the rest of the strips all the way to the top. I do this on both sides of both of the cabinets. The drawer bottoms are also made from 9mm plywood, and they'll need to be around 5mm narrower than the inside of the cabinet. These are going to slide on top of the drawer slide strips. I made two different sizes for the drawer frames, 4 that were 12 centimeters tall and 2 that were 6 centimeters tall. All the weight of these drawers will be on the drawer bottoms, so it's not necessary to use any screws here. I just use some brad nails, both for the frames themselves, but also to attach the drawer bottom to the frame. I used a piece of plywood to get an even overhang on both sides. This should be roughly 6 to 7 millimeters. So here you can see that the drawers are sliding really nicely on these plywood strips. For the drawer fronts, I'm just gonna have a cutout handle. So I drill a couple of holes and cut out the rest using my jigsaw. When installing the drawer fronts, I like to use some regular playing cards to get the right spacing. And on my miter station, I only used brad nails to fasten the drawer fronts, and they have been holding up well so far, so I'm just going to do the same here as well. I might have to get back later and add some screws if I feel that the drawer fronts are starting to get loose. For the top drawer, I couldn't access the inside of the drawer to fasten the front, so I took a Spanish one, as we say in Norway, which means I cheated a little bit and put a nail in the front. That held the front in place, and then I could add more nails from the inside of the drawer. Installing the first cabinet went pretty good, it slid in nicely, and I just had to tap it in place with a mallet before adding a couple of screws. The second cabinet started out really good, but then it wouldn't go underneath the 2x4 at the back. So I had to bring out my multi-tool and cut off the inside edge of the 2x4. That way the cabinet could go underneath and I could tap it in place and fasten with some screws.
So this is a really great addition to my shop, at least. I like that you can have it in this long position if you're doing like finishing or gluing up some longer pieces. And then of course, if you're doing some wider stuff, then you can fold it up, and after you've done, you sort of tuck it up against the wall again. So it doesn't have to take up a lot of space like in the middle of the shop. Also, there's plenty of storage, which I don't really need right now, but it's always nice to have some free drawers. I use the same system as I did on my miter saw station, so if you haven't checked out that video yet, you can do that afterwards. Again, if you want to have the woodworking plans, I have them available in both metric and in imperial. They are on my Etsy store. So thank you for watching. If you haven't seen my miter saw station video, you can check it out right here.